2.2 more on functions and their graphs preparation. Is there an informal way to think about relative maximum and relative minimums? You may find it helpful to relate the definition to graph peak and valleys. The relative maximum is the value at a peak, and the relative minimum is the value in a valley. Definitions of relative maximum and relative minimum. Now, I know all this googly gop looks maybe kind of complicated, but the concept itself is not that complicated. It just algebraically written, it looks a little more complicated. So basically, it's saying that this is the x value of b, this is the x value of a. Okay. Now, if we pick some between two different x values, the relative minimum would be the lowest point in between those two x values. Say, for instance, let's say this was 1, I don't know, that was a 3, right? So we could say between x value 1 and 3, there may be some minimum value, right? Which would be this one. This is the low point. And then that would be your y value, because we're looking at height, right? So the height, right, the minimum maximum are going to be kind of the y values, right? The y values. Okay, that's going to be the relative maximum. Minimum are going to be these highs, the y values there. And where they are is going to be the x value. So you have where, which is the x, and you have how high, how minimum, how maximum. And that's going to be more of your y values, right? So for instance, we go over here, and we say the relative minimum, say, between, negative pi, and let's say you're going all the way to 0, right? This point right here, x values of negative pi all the way to 0. You could say the relative minimum, or the smallest value in between those two ranges, you would have the relative minimum is that negative 1. Now let's say instead you said, well, what's the relative maximum, say, between 0 and positive pi? Okay, those are your x values. So you have a range. You say, well, within those range of x values, what's the highest point? And your point would be, well, the highest point would be 1, right? That's the highest point. So you could say, like, what's the highest point within North America? What's the highest point within South America? What's the highest point within, you get the point. So within some specific region, you could say what's the highest point, or you could say even what's the lowest point within specific regions, right, or specific areas. So we're kind of doing the same thing with x values. So we're saying in between those 2 points, what's the highest and what's the lowest. And that's how we get the relative. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not going to read this. I might come back and reference this whenever we're actually doing some work on some problems later on, but I'm not going to read this. Without concrete examples, this probably isn't going to make as much sense, but we will reference this later.